I have a confession to make. I'm a Rotherham United supporter. So what could I possibly know about A, football, or B, big business? But nonetheless, I'm here to introduce tonight's event. Well, I did read today that Rotherham are looking for new sponsors for next season. I rather thought they might look for a boxer short manufacturer, because like a pair of boxer shorts, they're loose at the back and have absolutely no ball control. And there's a third dirty one to follow that. I won't get them. Anyway, I think I probably brought the tone down low enough for a football crowd, so let's get on with the evening's events. We're very lucky to have a distinguished panel here this evening and an equally distinguished chair, although let's be honest, we looked for an eloquent footballer to host this evening's event, but very quickly decided it made much more sense to have a cricketer. So Ed Smith, in the middle there, is an author, he's a broadcaster and journalist, also extremely well known for his cricketing days in county cricket with Kent as captain of Middlesex and of course representing England. When an ankle injury led him to retire from cricket, he became a leader writer for the Times. He's written 3 books, most recently the excellent, got it here Ed, just in case.
Thanks very much.
The excellent What Sport Tells Us About Life, can vouch for it. His next book I believe is about luck and will be published by Bloomsbury. Do you have a release date yet?
It's about a year from now.
Oh, okay. You'll have to come back then.
That's right,
so
yeah. Bring a box of books.
Whereas he hasn't started writing.
Yeah. No, I have, honestly.
We'll do another book launch here, I guess. Ed presented his first television documentary for BBC One last autumn, and he's now a features writer for the Times. So please give him and the rest of the panel a warm welcome, and I'll leave you in his capable hands for the evening. Ed, thanks.
I was here, I was actually standing at this lectern, and I had to speak about sport and the free market, but I didn't have any help from the experts, so I felt a bit like a cuckoo in the nest as an amateur who's interested in economics, talking to professionals, so I'm really glad to have called in the reinforcements tonight. Well, as a journalist, I spend a lot of time trying to make subjects more intrinsically interesting than they actually are. That's what we do. So I can't tell you how happy I am to be here tonight, and the questions we're going to be addressing are so interesting, they don't need any beefing up or sexing up from me at all. Questions like, why can't England win the World Cup? Questions like, which matters more, club or country? Questions like, what should the role of government be in terms of getting what we want out of sport? What should sport, who should it be aimed at? Who's the consumer? Who matters? Who's it for? And to guide us through the most central questions, and football is the richest, most loved, most fluid and most exciting sport in the world at the moment, shines a fascinating light on how sport operates as a business. Just quickly want to introduce the 5 people who will be speaking, and then we'll have a discussion at the end. And I'm not going to keep getting up, they'll sort of just come up one after the other. And starting from this end and going away from me, Chris Brady of the BBP Business School is going to speak first, and then Steve Davies here at the IEA is going to speak second, and then Len Shackleton, who's Professor of Economics at East London, is going to speak, Stefan Szymanski from the Cass Business School, and then David Wheeldon, the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at BSkyB. So they're just going to speak for 5 minutes each, and then I'm going to lead a discussion with questions from you. I'm sure it'll be absolutely fantastic. So thanks very much for coming, and let's get stuck into sport and the big society.
Thank you, everybody. You did get a footballer here tonight because I used to play, failed. Professional footballer, failed. So professional football as a business for me is quite ruthless. You know, at 17-year-old, somebody literally came in the dressing room and went, you, and you, get your bags, we don't need you anymore. And that's quite difficult at 17 years old. But I'm comforted by the fact that had I made it at Lake Norient, where I was playing, I would now be running a pub somewhere. So, so every cloud has a silver lining. Right, so we've been asked to speak about the relationship between football and big business, football and big government, and football and big society. So I want to start very quickly, and I'm really going to try not to take up even the 5 minutes if I can, just so we can have as many questions. I'll start with big business. As Ed said, football is big business, whether we like it or not, whether people try to make out it's not a business. It is a business of some sort or another. Actually, the clubs themselves are relatively small businesses. Even in the Premier League, the average turnover of a Premier League club's around about 100 million a year, with the top around about 300 million and the bottom down around about 50 million. The championship average is around 16 million, with the top 33 million and the bottom 7 million. All right, so we're talking about quite small businesses effectively in the real world. Interestingly, while there's almost a one-to-one mapping from revenue to league position in the Premiership, in the Championship that's not the case. For example, in the last season for which we've got numbers, the 3 promoted clubs were ranked 4th. That was Birmingham. This is in the Revenue League. They were ranked 4th, 7th, which was Wolves, and 13th, which was Burnley. So those are the 3 clubs that were promoted. The 3 clubs that were relegated were ranked 8th, that's Norwich, 17th, that's Southampton, but 6th, that was Charlton. So whoever's I've offended here already, you know, that's the great thing about talking about football. You can offend people sort of almost by the second. But that's not, that again, you know, we keep saying these are unique. That's not unusual in very talent-dependent industries. You know, there are films that are made for hundreds and hundreds of millions, and there are indie films made for a few. And the hundreds and hundreds of millions ones don't always make money, and the indie ones do, and vice versa. So it's that type of an industry. There are films, however, irrespective of the size of the club, or the theatre for that matter, the industry to which these entities belong is massive. You know, the CMS industry, the leisure industry of which sport is a part, is the 2nd highest inward investor into the City of London after financial services. And it's the one area that we can pretty much guarantee is going to grow over the next 10 years, next 20 years, next 30 years. The leisure industry is going to grow and grow and grow. The football as an integral part of that leisure industry is going to grow with it. Yeah, so just to get back to the clubs themselves, obviously without whom the industry can't grow, they clearly need to be better managed and treated in a more sustainable way. I mean, everybody I think agrees with that. Every business and sector, however, believes itself to be unique. Each one talks about the uniqueness of their business or their industry, but the truth is all businesses have a pretty basic underlying similarities. They all have a product to sell, and football's got an absolutely brilliant product. They all have a cost centre, and football has a huge cost centre. They all have a profit centre, and football has a huge profit centre. Problem is balancing all of those 3. Now, as I see Philip Booth at the back there, who knows, who we've sat in rooms in Cass Business School on occasion discussing various things, none of which I think we agree on, but he will agree with me on this one thing: I am not an economist. So although I do subscribe to the Mr. McCulber School of Economic Theory, so it's around income and expenditure account that I run my businesses. So my management accountants come in, all I want to know is about income and expenditure. And clearly if I'm doing that in a football club, it's an interesting balancing act. My son 6 weeks ago took over as the CEO of Southend United. So in terms of my Rotherham friend over there, we managed to, I think, did we beat you a couple of weeks ago?
1-0 I think it was.
1-0. Yes, well, it was a rhetorical question, by the way, I knew. So
most people do manage to beat us.
Exactly, yeah, but you've got that left fondness.
Yeah, we have.
Anyway, so from my point of view, I'm suddenly right at the end of the spectrum where I can look very closely at the very bottom end, you know, 2nd division with a turnover of, you know, a couple of million maximum, and you know, sort of a ratio of salary to revenue of 70-75%. You know, really unsustainable business. How are we going to turn that round? So I'm able to look at that. So if anybody wants to ask any questions, provided they're not off the record, provided they're not too sensitive, commercially sensitive, I'm happy to answer questions very detailed about something I know very detailed about now, about the 2nd division. So that's football and big business. The other one was moving to big government. Football's clearly something with which big government must be concerned, not least because we directly spend millions managing to lose a World Cup bid, and which may have indirect economic problems in terms of confidence and other emotion in and around the economy. And football's our national sport. And as Ed quite rightly pointed out, it's the world sport. The final one, big society, I have no idea what that means. All I know is, from my age group, is that Margaret Thatcher said there wasn't one. It wasn't a society. And now David Cameron said there is one, and it's really big. And that's about as much as I know about that. Thank you very much.
Right, well, that was the ideal setup for me, really, because the talk you've just heard has already sort of raised several of the points I want to talk about. At the moment, the state of football is a bit paradoxical, because on the one hand, it's got record revenues, not just here but also abroad, but particularly in the British context. Since the advent of BSkyB and the widespread televising of football, the revenue streams going into the game have increased dramatically. And the amount of, this kind of sums of money that's being talked about now would have been simply unthinkable 30 or so years ago. And yet at the same time, the financial state of football is pretty desperate in many ways, or I should say more carefully, making a distinction which I'll expand on in a moment, the state of a lot of clubs is absolutely desperate. The number of clubs which are, I would say, actually insolvent, if the accountants did their job properly, is remarkably high. And there's a constant tendency within the sport for expenditure, and above all wage costs, to run ahead of income. So in the Mr. McCauley kind of economics we were talking about, they're on the kind of income, you know, £1 expenditure, £1 naught shillings and sixpence side of the ledger. A number of reasons for this which the economists can explain, such as the almost totally inelastic supply of top players and things of that sort, but I'll leave that to other people. Now what this means is that there's a lot of calls for radical, drastic institutional reform of the game. And these tend to take a number of forms. One of them is the, I think, completely short-sighted and misguided idea that we ought to get big business and people like Sky out of sport. This isn't going to happen anyway, but even so, it's a foolish and short-sighted way of thinking. There's also a lot of populist ranting and hostility to high wages paid to footballers, which again is completely misguided in my view and doesn't take account of the comparisons between footballers and a whole number of other comparable kinds of industries, not to mention the high risk and short lifespan of most football careers. This is one of those jobs where you can suddenly lose your job and have your entire career cut short at a moment just through an accidental clash on the pitch or something of that sort. But more serious are the kind of calls we're getting for reconstruction of British sport to introduce practices often found in American sports, notably things such as a collective salary cap, revenue sharing of the kind found in the most American sports, notably the National Football League, but also the NHL and the NBA. Revenue sharing in this context means, for example, in the case of the NFL, that all of the merchandising revenue made by teams and the selling of shirts and all that kind of stuff, as well as their television revenue, goes into a single common pot and is then shared out equally. So the teams with a very large following, such as the New York Giants or the Chicago Bears, are effectively subsidising teams which have, you know, absolute bugger all fans like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, owned by the owners of another team which I won't mention. Now, the point, this is often presented as being essentially about socialism. We were talking, myself and some of the other panellists earlier on, and it was remarked that when the NFL was actually set up in its modern form, following the merger of the old NFL and the AFL in the 1960s, they had a big powwow to sort out all the deals and how they were going to do this, the two conference model and so on. And this was described as being like, you know, some large number of American capitalists deciding they'd go for socialism. What I want to argue is that in fact that's not true, and that correct understanding of the economics of football would lead us to, or indeed of any kind of organised sport, would lead us to understand that that kind of thing, provided it happens in the right way, so to speak, should not be understood in that light. There's two general misunderstandings, I would argue. The first, it was touched on in a way in the previous talk, and that's the question of what the actual business unit or the competitive unit is in football. Is it the club? There's a common notion or apprehension that football clubs are businesses. They correspond to firms in a competitive market. And there are indeed a number of economic papers which argue this, including a famous one published a few years ago in the Scottish Journal of Political Economy. But in fact, I think that this is false, and there are many other economists who agree with this. According to this other perspective, the competitive unit, the thing that corresponds to the firm, is rather the league, or even the sport of football as a whole, which is the other way of thinking about it. The thing, of course, is that a single football team, what is the product that it's selling? Well, the product it's selling is not to go and see that team playing football by itself. The product it's selling is playing games with other teams. And to the extent that there's a reasonably close level of competition between the team you support and the other team, the game is more enjoyable to watch. There is evidence shown in the way that fans are prepared to pay for some games and not others, and higher prices for some leagues and not others, which suggests that, in fact, competitive leagues in which teams are relatively close together and you can't predict every year which team is going to come out on top, are more attractive and have a better quality product than ones where this is not the case. Now, obviously there are some people who will indeed pay to watch their own team beat a bunch of jokers, and one thing you might argue, which I'll just flag up and go on to, is that there might well be a segmentation within the fan base today between some people who really are just, in the terminology of other people, plastic fans who only want to see one team win and that's it. The second problem is the notion of football regulation as being something that would necessarily be imposed by government. The fact is that in reality, if you look at the history of football as a sport, what you see is a classic example of an emerged spontaneous order in which organisations like the League, the Football Association and ultimately FIFA are all regulatory agencies and bodies that emerge not through government power but through a spontaneous voluntary process. And what this means is that to the extent that this internal regulatory mechanism devises rules such as a salary cap and enforces them, we're not talking about some kind of collective planning, we're rather talking about something in which the real competitive entity, the league, so it organises its internal affairs as to make it a more attractive producer and product to the wider market, the television companies like Sky, or the punters who go and sit on their seats, or sadly too seldom these days stand up in the stadium. And what do we conclude from this? Well, there is one thing that we should think about this though, which is the interesting question of why in fact you have in one part of the world, North America, an organisation of sports whereby on a market basis I would argue you do get this phenomenon of internal revenue sharing within leagues and sports, and why you don't have this happening in many other parts of the world. And I think the answer from economics is that what we have here is a severe collective action problem. It arises from the history of the sport and the way that spontaneous order evolved. Essentially what happened in this country and elsewhere was that clubs appeared first, emerging as spontaneous associations of people who wanted to play the game on a competitive basis, and leagues were then formed, as the Football League was in this country, by clubs getting together to form a league. Now what that means is that therefore historically real power rests with the clubs. And the problem that raises is, as I say, a severe collective action problem, because all of the football clubs as entities within the league face essentially a prisoner's dilemma. They all know that it would be in their own best interests and the best interests of the sport as a whole, and therefore of the firm, if you will, as a whole, for there to be something like a salary cap. But they also know that their individual benefit will be maximised by being the one team that doesn't adhere to a salary cap while everyone else does. And everyone knows this, and there's a high trust problem, particularly when you're dealing with certain managers, I suspect. And the result is, including ones from clubs not too far from here, and the result is that therefore there's very great difficulty, it's almost impossible in fact to get agreements for these kind of arrangements to be put into effect. It may well be, however, that the current situation will provoke enough severe problems for that to actually happen. Certainly the alternative of government action is something to avoid at almost any cost, which is the thought I'd leave you with.
What Steve had to say there, I think, was very interesting, and I hope we can come back on that later on. But I want to talk about something slightly different at the moment. I've got three things I want to say. First of all, I want to talk about non-league football and the big society. Secondly, I want to talk about football clubs as small businesses, something which Chris touched on before. And thirdly, I've got some thoughts about football and employment law. Let me start by talking about the big society. Chris quite rightly suggests that this is a rather nebulous concept. But I guess what is being talked about here, to be fair to David Cameron, is that we're talking about ordinary people doing things for themselves, working together, pursuing common goals, some kind of continuing relationship, and without heavy government involvement. I'd argue that some elements of football, particularly in the lower leagues and more especially in non-league football, do meet these criteria. Who knows exactly how many clubs there are in this country that play football? I've heard a figure of about 7,000, which sounds about right for organised football teams.
That's just on Hackney Marsh.
Yeah. Of these, perhaps 500 or so involve some element of professionalism. They enter the FA Cup, They play at enclosed grounds, they pay some of their players and so on. Such clubs have long histories. Although their legal status and ownership structure has changed a great deal, they often date back to the 1870s, 1880s, a very long time ago. There are relatively few private institutions in this country, mainly churches, older independent schools, universities and learned societies who have a track record of that kind. If you look at most businesses in the normally thought of economy, they don't have that long record which football teams do. Non-league teams in particular are rooted deep in their communities. They were founded very often by Sunday schools, factories, pubs, etc. Virtually every small town or village in Britain has a team of this sort. And it features strongly in communal life if you look at local newspapers, websites and so forth. Some places I've visited following non-league football, it's difficult to see what else there is in the way of a community. If you've ever set foot in places like Alfreton or Frickley, for example, mining villages where the mines have long since disappeared, there isn't a lot going on apart from the football team. The supporters, although they're relatively few in number, really support teams. They travel long distances, they patronise teams' social clubs, they do unpaid work, selling programmes, staffing the turnstiles, sweeping the terraces, repainting the stands and so forth. In periods of emergency, they really rally round. Just before Christmas, Welling United, here at Blue Square South, faced insolvency over a relatively small debt to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. But Welling's average gates were about 600 or so, but in a few days they raised £65,000 to pay off HMRC just from small donations. Less dramatically, I remember at my own club last season on Boxing Day there was 2 inches of snow on the ground. Within 3 hours, a team of volunteers had cleared it and the game went on. You don't get this level of involvement as a Manchester United fan. You just turn up, you pay your money and you eat the prawn sandwiches. Or more likely, you watch it these days on satellite TV in a bar in Hong Kong. And it's not just individuals. Local businesses also support teams. If you look in the programme or look on the advertising hoardings of small clubs, you see how many small businesses, florists, funeral parlours, pubs, restaurants, etc., are involved in supporting the team and indeed are supported by them. This is presumably the kind of thing which David Cameron wants to see. Despite his views that we're in some way a broken society, I see no evidence of this in non-league football. We have the most extensive network of small clubs anywhere in the world, and despite the occasional loss of an old name through insolvency, they often bounce back in AFC Chester or AFC Telford or AFC Halifax, or the most recently successful case, AFC Wimbledon. Now, what are the implications for policy about this? My own feeling is not very much. Direct government involvement is not what non-league football needs. However, I think we can reflect on the fact that a lot of these teams, and indeed teams only just below the Premier League, Championship teams and League 1 and 2 teams for that matter, are still relatively small businesses. And like all small businesses, they have a set of problems which I think we should be concerned about, not about football in particular. At the end of last year, the Federation of Small Businesses brought out a paper, for example, which pointed out that problems of lower league teams and non-league teams are essentially those of other small businesses. There are common concerns such as the increase in VAT, business rates, higher charges imposed by local authorities, difficulty getting planning permission for minor works, more extensive licensing arrangements for bars and things like this, a whole host of health and safety issues, employment law, and so on. Most small businesses complain of this, and football teams do as well. There are some particular problems in football, such as charges for policing games, requirements about fan segregation, things like standing rules and so forth. There is a proposal before Parliament from Don Foster of the Liberal Democrats to restore the possibility of standing, for example, which 91% of football fans say they want. That's an issue which perhaps we might be concerned with. But in general, I think football is a relatively small business. It faces the same problems as other businesses. We don't want special favours for football teams, but we do want to make sure that as businesses they get the best chance possible to operate for the benefit of themselves and the community. Right, a final thing I wanted to touch on was about employment law. Football has always been an extremely funny business when it comes to employment. You'll be aware, of course, that the old retain and transfer system was maintained well past its sell-by date. It was an anachronistic form almost of indentured labour, which was rightly swept away in the 1960s, and nobody wanted that back. But employment in football is still very different from most forms of employment these days. And I think actually these days that some of the things which we see in football are things which ought to be replicated more widely in employment. First of all, letting the market, rather than Will Hutton or somebody, determine what should be paid to people. Secondly, signing of contracts for limited periods. Elsewhere in the economy, we've moved to a situation where after a year, although now it's going to be extended I think to 2 years, you can't get rid of someone without making them redundant, going through a whole load of hoops and possibly making mistakes and ending up paying significant amounts of compensation. In football that doesn't happen. You have contracts, when the contract expires, that's it. Thirdly, we have in football payment of transfer fees for people who are in contract, and especially for young people, or young footballers who've been developed by a club. If firms elsewhere in the economy could do that, then possibly we could save the £350 million a year which we're currently paying to firms to take on apprentices, which the coalition have told us in fact is going to increase to 600 million a year very soon. A fourth thing which I find from employment in football is that wages can go up or down. People expect at the end of their career to be playing out their career for less money than they were getting when they were at the top of their game. And yet elsewhere in employment, of course, we expect that wages rise and rise and rise and rise, and that you earn more when you're in your 60s or something. There's no particular logic to this, and it creates all sorts of problems like final salary pension schemes and things like this. And finally, of course, and perhaps timely given the coalition's abandonment of mandatory retirement, we have in football, as you know, at 17 is quite early to retire, Chris, but at least in football you do know that you're going to have to retire. What we've probably ended up with in employment law in this country now is a whole raft of problems associated with getting people out once they get beyond 65 or so, when we're going to, I think we're going to see a huge number of tribunal cases related to this when firms want to get rid of people at that age. I'm not quite sure by what stratagem football manages to escape the employment law miasma which surrounds the rest of us, but I wish I knew what it was, and perhaps we should be looking for a wider application of it. Thanks.
One of the benefits of going later on is that you get to adjust your views in light of what's already been said. And having had several very strongly pro-market views, I think it's incumbent on me to give the other side, because I'm saying, following me, I don't think we're going to get the anti-market view either. So I better stand in and make the case. So there is around the corner there's a parliamentary select committee sitting, has been sitting for the last month or so, looking into football and looking really as to whether there should be increased regulation of some form of football, whether there's a case for government intervention. And I think it's quite likely that the outcome of this committee will produce a report, and I don't think what the report says will necessarily be implemented, but it will be used as a basis for some form of government intervention, because the minister, the DCMS minister in charge, has already announced that he's quite keen in finding ways to increase fan control over football clubs, whatever that might mean. And so it's quite likely that something's going to be done, I think. So one question is, well, you know, in some ways you might say, why now? And this one Chris was saying, right now you'd say that football in this country is terribly successful. So we have the highest revenues of any football league in the world. We have the highest, the largest overseas sale of broadcasting rights by any football leagues in the world by some margin. Nearly half the Premier League's revenue now comes from overseas rights owners. It has the highest total attendance of any league in the world, and if you compare to where it was, say, 25 years ago, attendance at the Premier League is up 75% over what it was 25 years ago, and attendance at, if you go down to the championship level, actually attendance is up by more than 170% over what it was 25 years ago. So we've seen a remarkable resurgence in football in this country in the last 25 years, and yet there is huge discontent. There is clearly a lot of people who are upset, and a lot of those people who are upset are the fans, the people who go to watch football. What are they upset about? They're upset about ticket prices. They see ticket prices that are double, 3 times the level that you pay, for example, to go and watch football in Germany, for instance. They are upset that their clubs seem constantly to be going insolvent, and they seem to have to be stepping in at the last minute to bail the club out. That there seems to be, that they are upset that their clubs seem to be falling into the hands of people who are either of ill will or incompetence, who are driving their clubs into the ground. They're upset about they are upset about the wages that are being paid to the players, and they're upset that the players seem to hold the clubs to ransom, and the fans who bring that revenue in seem to get no gratitude, no thanks from those who are actually paying their wages. They're upset by the cost of watching football. They're upset that it's expensive. It gets more expensive every year to subscribe, and they are upset about what they're having to pay. They're upset that, many people are upset that there are so many foreign players coming into the English Premier League that, as they see it, there are no opportunities for English players to play at a high enough level to represent their country, and they're concerned that the England team is suffering because of what's going on in the English Premier League. And they're upset because they say, look, this is a sport which is self-governing, where the people who run this sport are the Football Association, and they are charged with running football, and yet they seem to be entirely at the making decisions at the behest of the Premier League and perhaps a small number of clubs at the top of the Premier League. And sorry, I have to say this, but probably they will also, these people will also say it's being run in the interests of Sky. That's the litany of complaint. Now, I don't necessarily agree with any of that, and we could look at all of those issues, and indeed, when I gave my evidence to the committee, I was roundly turned on as being, you're too right-wing, you're too pro-business, you're too much in favour of the clubs. But here's the point I would make to you. It's no good saying, if you think that the way football is organised in this country is working well, and there's lots of evidence from a business angle that it's working very successfully, it's no use saying that and just hoping that that's going to work at the level of politics. So that's not what politics are like. Politicians, they are elected by their constituencies, so they are going to respond to the interests of what their constituents. And if their constituents feel it's all unfair and wrong, then the politicians are going to change it. So you can say as much as you like about it, the state of football being great and keep the government out. That's not the reality of what's going to happen in politics if you just ignore the discontent of the fans. Now, I think there's the key interesting issue is this, that what's changed about football in the last 25 years is it's become more commercial. It was run, what the specific problems that got football into a mess in the old days was that it was not run commercially. It was run by amateurs, and it was run into the ground. And what happened in the last 25 years was it became professional. There was professional management in running that. And I don't mean them running the team, but in terms of running the organisations. And that's been a huge benefit to football. But it's also taken football away from the fans. It's moved them away. The ordinary fan feels now more distant from their football club than they ever did. When they were ramshackle or amateurish organisations, people felt closer to them. Now they feel further away. And if there's anything in this big society idea, like everybody else, I'm pretty unsure as whether there is anything in it, but there must be something about how you bring together these interests of running something efficiently as a proper, well-run organisation, but being closer to the fans, to the people, the actual people who pay, the people who keep the show on the road. And I think that's the challenge. I'm not saying I have any answers, but I think that's we shouldn't stick our head in the sands and say we can carry on as we are. I don't think we can carry on as we are, because politically, I don't think that's acceptable anymore.
I'm obviously here representing the big business side of things, and I'm not going to pretend that Sky is a small player in all of this. Of course we're not. But I have to say, Stefan, I don't really recognise the tale that you have told, or even, frankly, the sort of political hand-wringing that you've described either. So, I mean, I guess I'm speaking from the point of view of Sky, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think we've contributed to football over the years. I also, Stephen, am a supporter of Arsenal, and I'm very happy to see my team beat Minnows, which is why I went to the Carling Cup final. Doesn't happen often enough, in my view. Look, the title of what I want to talk about really is what Sky ever done for football. You remember that Life of Brian phrase? And I think I want to just focus on three things. Obviously the money side of things, finance, but also a little bit about the exposure that multi-channel television's brought to football, and then finally a bit about innovation. First of all, on the finance side, look, Sky spends a lot of money on football, about 11 billion on sport in total since Sky Sports was founded 20 years ago. A good proportion of that has gone to the sport of football. But we've always taken the view that it is up to football to choose how to spend that money. Sky doesn't try to organise the game for its own benefit. It is up to the football bodies to decide how to organise the game and how to organise the clubs. And I think that they've done a pretty good job of it over those 20 years. And you just need to look at the number of grounds that have been redeveloped over that period, 50 odd. The amount of money that passes through the game to the grassroots. I think in the Premier League, talk about them and their clubs being responsible for 60 million a year, the Football Foundation another 40 million going through to grassroots football. The fact that 19% now of Premier League attendees are women. Now I think that's a big change on where it was 20 odd years ago. And if we're going to talk about the big society is surely about all people in communities being able to get involved in football. And I think before we saw the changes that the influx of money has brought, it was not the case that half of society got involved in football. Women tended not to, because the grounds were not places that families generally went to experience their entertainment. I think also that what we've managed to do is to help sport find its commercial value. Before multi-channel television, English football broadcast rights were running at about £3 million a year, which I reckon is about Jermaine Defoe's salary. Now you can argue whether or not Jermaine Defoe is worth £3 million a year, but I certainly think that English football was worth a lot more than that. And it was very simple. There was no real competition for the rights. And subsequent to Sky and others coming into the market, the Premier League, the FA, Scottish football have also been pretty effective at leveraging the value of rights. And if you think that Sky has any sort of favourable deal from bodies, think again. Every time the rights come round, the atmosphere at my place gets pretty tense, because we know that we have to pay the fair value.